Hello, good evening. Um, we'll begin here again in Genesis chapter 10, and we'll be talking about the nation of three sons of Noah. And this chapter is based on, as I mentioned before, individually. We look at chapters and we say that this it means that God is speaking to an individual, but no, this is basically the book about nations. The Old Testament speaks about nations, individual, yes, but also it reaches down to nations. And we'll begin here in the sons of Noah. And here you see the nations of the earth as it overspread. And then in verse 1 in Genesis chapter 10, it says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And unto them were sons born after the flood." Here it mentions the generation of the sons of Noah. And after the flood, they began to give birth to nations. The sons of Noah began to give birth to the nations. And here it begins with Japheth. And in Japheth, it goes down all to from verse 2 to verse 3. And the sons of Japheth, as mentioned, is Gomer, Magog, Media, Javan, Tubal, and Mashek, Tyrus. And first of all, you mentioned here is Magog. And Magog is today, according to expositors, it's a modern day Russia, Yugoslavia, between Russia and it mentions also in the sons of Javan, it says Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, Dodidim, sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togama. And also Flavius Josephus identified the offspring of Magog, as we mentioned before about Magog, as also it's called the Scythians. And these are the people of the North Black Sea. According to him, the Greeks called the Scythia the Magogia, which means Magog, symbolizes Magog. And that's from historian Flavius Josephus. So in verse 5, here it says, we're going to talk about the crossing borders. And it says, "By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations." Again, it says the isles of Gentiles that are divided, everyone after their tongue and after their families and their nations. And it says, by these, everyone that is divided here, it's also, it mentions, for example, kings in Tarshish. You say the kings of Tarshish in Psalm 72 verses 10. It says, "The kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents, and kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts." Again, the word here we use the word isles, and which I just read here in Genesis chapter 10 verses 5, but also in Psalms verses 72 verse 10 speaks about the isles. What does that mean? We get the word isles by saying island. That's where we get the word isles, island, signifying the distant land or the land beyond the sea. And here you see the distant coast. And God is not for integration. Man to live apart in their own boundaries. There's a boundary God has made for man to live on earth, and we have to be separated into our boundaries. Also, you see here, it says the kings of Sheba, and again, as I mentioned in Psalm 72 verses 10, they have to offer gifts. So, also in Jeremiah, if you read also in Jeremiah 2 verse 10, it says, "For pass over the isles of Shittim, and see and send unto Kedar, and consider diligently and see if there be such thing." Again, it mentions again the word pass the isles of Shittim, and Shittim here means Cyprus, the island Cyprus. So this is to cross some kind of a coast, to cross the coast or to cross the border. So he says again, he said, "By these are the isles of the Gentiles, divided by their lands, everyone after their tongue, their families, and their nations." So we have to look at the nations as each of them has their own boundaries and their borders and their own places that God is going to divide these sons of Noah, these nations, which becomes nations, because that's what they are. They are nations, and they are all going to have boundaries and lands and borders across the isles. That's what it's called, the isle, meaning islands, or sea coasts. So we will come again in also talking about the nations of the earth. We come to the line of Ham, and we're going to talk about the Hamites. In verse 6, it says, he mentions the sons of Ham and their descendants. And he says, "And the sons of Ham, Cush and Mizraim and Puth and Canaan." Again, here are the sons of Ham. And Cush today is what we call Africa. And Mizraim means, or the word Mizraim means fortress, and is used to indicate as the land of Egypt. And Puth is here as ancient Libya. And then we have Canaan. And then in verse 7 it says, "And the sons of Cush, Seba and Havilah and Sapta and Ramah and Sabtecha, and the sons of Ramah and Sheba and Dedan." Again, here it mentions the sons of Cush, which is Seba, Havilah, Sapta, Ramah, Sabtecha, and the sons of Ramah. And then mentions again in Seba and Dedan. So these are the line of the Hamites. And the Hamites is the father of the blacks. The blacks, the dark skin, what we call people, the dark skin complexion of humanity. The father of the blacks, called the Hamites, that came from the land of Egypt. And all the way down to the coast of Africa and throughout. So we come here again, we're going to look at a character in the Bible called Nimrod, and then which begins here in the verse 8. And Genesis chapter 10 verses 8 says, "And Cush begat Nimrod." And the word here is, he began to be a mighty one in the earth. And he says Cush begat Nimrod, who is a mighty one in the earth. And the word here, again, I will mention, began to be, speaks about the natural work of this man, Nimrod. He's a natural man. He's He's a self-promoted man. He's a self-willed man. He's a man of the earth, obviously. But here he says the word called began to be speaks like Noah who began to be. And the word began to be here is the word means in Hebrew means shalal, and in Strong's Concordance it means same as the word began means to me same as defile. It's a defilement, to profane and to pollute, to desecrate. And also you can use the word pu'al, P-U-A-L in Hebrew word. It means to begin to profane. In other words, it begins to profane the name of the Lord. That's what it means. It says that Nimrod, that Cush begat Nimrod, he began to be a mighty one in the earth. Now, we're going to look at more in this Nimrod character, and we're going to see more about him, and which continues here in Genesis chapter 10, verses 9. It says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, what does it mean to be a mighty hunter before the Lord? What does it mean to be a mighty hunter before the Lord? And before stating the obvious, we'll read few scriptures to solidify the statement here. I will read Jeremiah 16 verses 16. And it says in Jeremiah 16 verses 16, it says, behold, I will send forth many fishers, said the Lord, and they shall fish them. And after I will send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill and out of the holes of the rocks. Again, moreover, in addition to that, I will read Micah 7:2, which states also, it says, the good man is perished out of the earth, and there is none upright among men. They all lie in wait for blood. Again, here it says, they hunt every man his brother with a net. Now, the word fishers here can be allocated to the same meaning used by the Lord Jesus himself when he says to Peter, I will make thee fishers of men. And the mighty hunter here is not as the hunter of animals. It does not mean that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord or hunter of animals before the Lord. This is not what the meaning is. Rather, more as a hunter of men's souls. He's a hunter of men's souls, and basically a person who infringes other men's will. Nimrod is the type of man that infringes other man's will. Is a hunter of man, and the word of God in the beginning says, do not have a dominion over the fish, the cattle, the seas, the creatures. But God never gave another man to be dominant over another man. In fact, it's not natural for man to find themselves being dominant to another man. So, because this is a result of the fall. But you see here that Nimrod is a dominant figure. He was a dominant figure that hunts the souls of man, and in other words, he infringes the souls of man to do his work. In the word slavery, this is the first taskmaster. If you're saying the word slavery, if you mean in the context of slavery, this is the first taskmaster that has. This is basically gathering of man's souls. And he was a rebellion. He was a rebellious man before the Lord. And apparently, he called to defy God. And you will see that later on. But this man is someone with the evil heart of rebellion. And apparently, man, during the flood, they basically defy God in a way, or blame God because of the flood, and their heart became, you know, defiant. They became defiant, and this man is one of the ones that is going to gather all these men to defy the Lord and begin his conquest here. So it says that he is a hunter. He is a hunter before the Lord, or in a way, as they can say, he is a hunter in the face of the Lord, in a defilement of the Lord. And this is Nimrod. It says he was a hunter, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Again, it says before the Lord. And also it says again, before the Lord. He mentioned it twice. Now, again, I said this before the Lord means, according to expositors, it means in the face of the Lord. He's a defiant. He's a defiant character in the face of the Lord. So, and we're going to look at one of the things his conquest. First of all, he says here that he began to, it says in verse 10, Genesis chapter 10, and he says, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Now, this is the Tower of Babel, and we know the Tower of Babel is an act that imposes God, that opposes God's way. And this is the first civilization that is built up here that opposes God. You see, this Nimrod had a heart of rebellion, and he opposes God's way. And he says, and Erech and Acre, again he says, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Again, the word Shinar here means is the word Babylon that describes Babylon. It's called the land of Shinar, and here is Nimrod's kingdom, and this is a civilized world system being built here. And it's a defiant system that put man in place, and it put man in a place to defy God. Today we have a civilized system that is built up today, and we are all just building this called Tower of Babel. This is a tower of Babylon. Babylon is now a system. It's a system that defies God, and it's the land of Shinar. But here, interesting to know that the black race here built the first civilization here, and it says that man begins to become dominant. The word here, man is now dominant over another man. And also, not just another man become dominant, and also define God's plan, because God says be fruitful and multiply. But we're going to see this defiance that wants to stay one place and defy God. So we come here also in the civilizations of Nimrod. It says in verse 11, it says, out of the land went forth Asshur and built Nineveh. Again, you see the city of Nineveh here. And in the city of Rehoboth, and Kala. And this came out of the city out of Babel. This is a city that protrudes out of Babel and out of the land of Erech and Akkad. And it says Kalnear and Ashbor. And here it says, and built Nineveh and the city of Rehoboth and Kala. So we have here the city that came out of Babel, out of the city of Babel. Then in verse 12, and it says, and Rezin between Nineveh and Kala, and the same city, and the same is a great city. So Rezin between Nineveh and Kala, all these were great cities that just came out of this world civilization called Babel. And in verse 13 and 14, you have Mizraim, Ludium, you have Anamim, and Lehabim, and Neptuhim, and Kesluhim, of whom came out all these, is called, of whom came out the Philistines. You got the Philistines now, that is mentioned here also in part of Nimrod's conquest. And then he says here in Captorium, is also mentioned here. Again, these are all civilizations and nations that is coming out from this city called Babylon, and which is the civilizations of Nimrod. And from Genesis chapter 10 all the way from verse 15 to 18, we're going to go and we're going to talk about the line of Canaan. And we see Canaan is the cursed line. This is the cursed line that, remember when Noah cursed Ham, he says, cursed be Canaan. He cursed Canaan. His his grandson. And here you're going to see this cursed line, what this cursed line entails. So we're going to begin in verse 15. It says, and Canaan begat Sidon, his firstborn, and Het. And Canaan came out Het, and then Jebunite, Ammonite, Girgashite, Hivite, and Akatite, Arkite, and Sinanite, and Arvadite. You have Zemarite, and Hamathile, and you have the Canaanites. Now you see Canaanites. It says Canaanites here is spread abroad. And you have these Canaanites here. And he says in verse 19, and he says, and the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gera unto Gaza, and as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah. Now we mentioned the Sodom and Gomorrah came out of the line of Canaanites. You remember when I mentioned before that the Canaanites became a polluted, sexual polluted line. Now you have the fruit of it came out. That's where Sodom and Gomorrah came out of, from Canaan, through Canaan. And Sodom and Gomorrah is a very perverted city. It's a very perverted city. And then you have Admah, and you have Zeboim, and you have even unto Lasha. Here it mentions that the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, and then the Sidonians, and you have the Sidonians that came here, and then you have Gera that went on to Gaza, and Gera went on to Gaza, and it goes to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now I mentioned Sodom and Gomorrah is a sexual perverted city. This is a sexual perverted city. And here it says in Genesis, and I'll read in the book of Genesis, verses 13 to 12. And it says, Abraham was in Canaan. And it says, Abraham, that's where Abraham dwelt. He dwelt there, and he says that Lot pitched his tent at Sodom and Gomorrah. So this where is Sodom and Gomorrah is described here. And we continue to Admah and Zeboim. It says even to Lasha. And we're going to see more about this. But again, we know that this is the land that was cursed. And this is where Abraham went to. This is where Abraham was. Abraham went to the land of Canaanites, where the Canaanites live, obviously. And also in Genesis 13 verses 14, this is where it says, and the Lord said unto Abram, after Lot was separated from him, lift up thy eyes and look from the place where thou art, north and southward, eastward and westward. You know, God told Abraham to look northward, southward, eastward, that I will give you all the lands of the Canaanites. You see, because of this land, God gave, because these people, God gave the land, all the lands of these people to Abraham. Because this line, it says that they will be servants. This is what the Canaanites going to be. It says, curse be unto Canaan, you will be servants of servants. So eventually, the Canaanites begin to serve the Israelites, because that's what the curse was cursed upon them, because of what Ham did to Noah, because of dishonor, because of perversion that came in place, and these people became perverted, and God gave Abraham all the lands of the Canaanites. And here he says in Genesis, also going back in Genesis 13 verse 15, he said, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And he said, to all the land you see, I will give it to them, for your seed forever. Also in Genesis 13 verses 17, it says, arise and walk throughout the land. Now this is the land of Canaan. And he says, the length and breadth, all the lands. And God says also in Genesis 15, from verses 18 to 21, it says, say, to thy seed have I given the land, from the river of Egypt to the great river of Euphrates. Now nations here he's going to mention he says the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaims, the Ammonites, the Canaanites, the Gershites, and the Jebusites. Now this is all the land God gave to Abraham through the line of Canaan, through the line of the Canaanites. God gave Abraham the entire land. And that's the character. Again, the character of God is that God is sovereign. He gives the land to whomever he wishes. And most of the time when people commit some kind of abomination in the land, God will give the land to somebody else. And God will give the land to whomever he wishes. And that's who God is. He's the land owner, the ultimate land owner. And here you have in verse 20, it says, these are the sons of Ham. And this, again, these are the black race. I call it the black race, the African race. Of course, they are all rejected line, because Ham and Japheth were all rejected line, and that's why they're mentioned first, because we're going to go to the line of Shem next. And the line of Shem is the accepted line. So we're going to move to the accepted line here, the line of Shem, which begins in chapter 10, verse 21. It says, also, it says, unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder, even unto him were children born. Now he mentions the sons of, he's going to mention the sons of Shem. And here the children of Shem is Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, Aram. And he says the children of Aram are Oz, Hul, and Gisha, and Mash. And in verse 23, it says the children of Shem are Arphaxad. And Arphaxad begat Salah, and Salah begat Eber. And in verse 21, it says, and unto Eber were born two sons, and the name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother name was Joktan. Again, you have Peleg and Joktan. The day the earth was divided. Here he's talking about a division, okay, of these brothers, these nations. You see, these are nations. And here you have the line of Shem, begins here in verse 26. And it says, Joktan begat Almodad and Shelep, and it says Hazar Mareth, and he has Jira and Hadoram and Uzal and Diklag, Obal, Abimael and Sheba and Ophi and Havilah and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. And then you have all these were the sons of Joktan mentioned here. Again, the line of Shem. We're beginning to the line of the Shem, the Shemites. These are the accepted line, and this is the line of Christ. This is where Jesus Christ is coming. Through this line, you have Abraham, you have David, and you have Christ through this line. So we have in verse chapter 10, verse 30, it says, these are they dwell in Misha and Sepha, the mountain of the east. And in verse 31, it says, these are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in the land, after their nations. Again, these are all the sons of Shem. And you have in verse 32, it mentions here, it says, these are the sons of Noah, after their generation. So it wraps up with in verse 32 that these are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. See, by these were the nations divided. So all these people are mentioned, these individuals, these are nations. These are not all just individual people. These are nations, okay? And I mentioned Canaan, that he will be a servant to the servants, you know. But it's not talking about Canaan, the person that is going to be servant. He mentioned the nation. As I mentioned before, God gave the Canaanites, the land of the Canaanites, to Abraham, which was fulfilled as the curse of Canaan, that is going to be servants to his brothers, Shem and Japheth. So, but individual Canaan was not a servant, so but the nations that came out of him were. So wrapping it up in verse 32, it says, these are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. Now all sons of Noah are nations of the earth. And to wrap it up, it says in Genesis 9 verses 19, going back to Genesis 9 verse 19, it says, these are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. The whole earth were overspread from these three sons of Noah. So we're going to continue on and we will see more in the line of Shem. But here, God is basically has rejected this line, which is the line of the Hamites and the line of Japheth. Now we're going to look more into this line of Shem. And we're going to go down from this line and we're going to follow this line of Shem all the way down to throughout the Bible now. And we're not going to talk more about the other rejected line. We're going to see through this line all the way to throughout from now on. So we're going to talk about it and we're going to begin in Genesis chapter 11. But until then, God bless you, precious saints.